Well, hello, everybody. It's February the 20th, 2025, and welcome to Leaders on the Frontier Live. My name is David Leeson. I'm your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier. And I'm certainly very excited today as we talk about Canada, our beloved country, and as we get some, I think, very incisive information from our special guest who I'll introduce in a moment. We all know that we care and love our country, and our country is going through a challenging time. And it's interesting what's happening around us, let alone this week. We all, I think, um, had a sigh of relief to see that there was a fiery crash, and everyone survived that fiery crash at Toronto Pearson's um, airport this week. It was really quite astounding how a plane came in and then rolled over. And it's remarkable, thankfully, that everyone survived. So we're glad everybody could join us. Safe. I hope you're safe and sound wherever you are. And thank you, Matthew, for joining us as well. We've got a lot of regulars from coast to coast, and we're grateful that you could participate in our discussion. It's interesting how we so much appreciate your comments and questions, and this one is certainly a good example of that today as we talk about Canada. So, in some other headlines, we noticed that we've got a lot of things going on as we talk about challenges of tariffs from the United States, of course. We even have Gosh, did you notice, did anyone watch the Four Nations hockey tournament this past week? And in Montreal, we even had fans booing the United States national anthem. What do you think about that? Was that a good idea? I know that there was certainly a wave of reaction in the United States to that. I would say a fair amount of disappointment and anger. And tonight, I believe, is the final playoff when it comes to Canada versus the United States. So let's wait and see what happens there. We also know that there's other headlines. For example, did you notice that I believe it was the day before yesterday, we had the province of BC is stepping away a little bit from safer drug supply. I believe it was announced that participants must now have doses witnessed to prevent diversion into the larger drug market. So it's kind of hard to believe that you have jurisdictions in Canada are giving out all kinds of drugs to people, all in the name of quote safe supply. What do you think about that policy? Does that make sense when it comes to safeguarding people's health by giving them out a whole variety of drugs and legalizing, in fact, hard drugs? Does it make sense? Well, if you certainly paid attention to some of our discussions, we know that approach is very problematic. It makes sense perhaps to decriminalize drugs, but how do you treat people? How do you get at the whole issue that people need help and models of support that so they can get rid of their addiction and become fully healthy, functioning members of our society? So there's a lot of headlines going on. And as you notice, there's been a lot of discussion today in light of challenges regarding tariff threats from the United States to Canada about the need to get on with getting our policy house in order in Canada. How do we improve our economy? There's even been talk about, well, we need to buy more Canadian. We need to, for example, introduce free trade among the provinces. Imagine that. So there's an awful lot of discussion here about how we get into the reality of how do we get our country moving again. There's concerns about our declining standard of living, our declining productivity. These are all symptoms, I would argue, certainly coming from the Frontier Center for Public Policy. These are symptoms of bad public policy that doesn't serve our country. So we're going to get into that a little bit. It's interesting that I have a question here from Capitalist Spy. Another question to ask at the end is what conservative minded people can do to fight these this leftist media? I think that's a really good question in the sense that for a democracy, a society to work well, we need good information. We need fact-based information that really helps us understand what the issues are. So maybe we'll come back to that because I think our special guest has some very good insights on that issue, among many others. So it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest. He completed some 35 years of active service in the Canadian Armed Forces in May 2007. And Lieutenant General Michel Maisonneuve is our special guest today. And so a warm welcome to you, General. We're so glad you could join us.
Merci beaucoup, David. Je suis content d'être avec vous. Very happy to be with you.
Merci, monsieur. And bienvenue to Leaders on the Frontier. As we talk about, in many ways, the issues are outlined very well, and I recommend a superb book that you wrote called In Defense of Canada, Reflections of a Patriot. And I certainly very much enjoyed your book. And so my question to you is, General, you retired from active military service, and I believe you was also a leader within the armed forces. Why did you decide to take the time to write this book?
First of all, after my service in uniform, 35 years, I was then a senior official, a senior public employee, and I went to the Royal Military College in Saint Jean and reopened that and I spent 10 years plus there. So that gave me a total of probably a little over 45 years of service to our country. I had been unhappy with the way our country was moving, especially after that I took the uniform off, and especially since 2015, to be completely honest with you. And so I was honored to receive the Vimy Award in 2020, but it was not presented till 2022. And at that point, I was asked to make a speech about, how I felt about receiving the award, and I decided it was going to be kind of the time for me to give my opinion as a Canadian, as just a Canadian who believes in our country, who served it for 45 years plus, and so I did make this speech. It was I think a hard-hitting speech, and I said, here are the things I'm unhappy with. But I said, still, the world is wonderful, and we have so much potential in our country. Sadly, I was canceled the next day by organizations, lost friends, lost a lot of people that I appreciated, and so decided that and some of the speech was picked up by the National Post, actually, only the National Post, and I decided to to kind of expand on those ideas in a book. So it's a small book. It's my opinion out there. The whole idea, David, was to create a dialogue, and sadly, it did not do that. No one came to see me to say, like, I disagree with what you said here. I agree with this part, and here's why I disagree, and let's have a dialogue and maybe come to an understanding. But it didn't happen.
Well, I think the good news is that you are certainly in your own way creating a dialogue. I had the pleasure of meeting you at a terrific event in Winnipeg as you spoke to a gathered crowd. And I know that you've been going right across the country talking about this book because you've got a very important message, I think, in terms of how do we renew this great country. And I certainly respect your leadership on so many fronts. You've served not only domestically here, but on so many theaters with NATO and other nations like the former Yugoslavia, in some very difficult situations. So you bring I think, a very important perspective on really the state of our country. And I think what you did for me is help underline the connection between how seriously we take issues of defense of our nation with domestic issues, in terms of how we're seen, in terms of our relationships with our allies, for example, the United States. And I think you draw these themes together very well. So bravo on you, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you. And actually, what I tried to do in the book is to explain where where I was in those times when Canada was at the table, where Canada was punching above its weight, I think, and using those ideas to say, well, here's where we are today. Here's the difference with where we were and where we are now, and where we have the potential to grow, to go. And so, so the issues I tried to raise in there, and to me, there are two crises in Canada. We have a crisis of leadership and a crisis of complacency. Canadians are complacent, kind of not, we had to get Trump to make us feel a little bit patriotic. This is wrong. We ought to be proud of our country every single day. We ought to celebrate our potential and actually achieve our potential and go beyond. So these are the issues that I tried to raise in the book, that I continue to raise when I speak.
So that's very interesting. Yeah, and today I'm looking forward to diving into this topic with our audience more about the current state of affairs and how this is interrelated. It's really a lot of dots to connect here. So one of the things that I notice here in the audience is a lot of comments. For example, Lauren says, "I don't agree with booing of any anthem, but it could have only been a couple of hundred people. It doesn't necessarily reflect all Canadians." And I think, Lauren, that's a very thoughtful comment. So I know that I think many people were horrified that people would boo a national anthem. So my question to you, General, I mean, you've worked very closely with other military counterparts from the United States in many capacities, whether it was NATO. After 9/11, you have a very powerful story of making the trek quickly to Tampa, Florida, where there was the headquarters with, of course, the famous General Tommy Franks in terms of that aftermath of those terrorism attacks. What is the significance? Because in the military, as much of Canadian life, we have symbols, we have customs, we have practices. The booing of a national anthem, um, is that actually an incident of sorts? I mean, without trying to sound dramatic, I know I get it that Canadians are kind of offended emotionally that somehow we're being attacked as a country. But the booing of a national anthem at a sporting event, is that a smart idea?
Not to me. I think it's horrible. And frankly, you have to understand that, Americans individually, they have no idea what these tariffs mean, and whether there should be. They're worried about the same things Canadians are worried about. Where's my next meal coming from? Where, can I afford my house? Can I, that's your ordinary American is that way. So when you're booing the anthem, you're actually booing Americans generally. Okay, you may not
Mm,
like Trump, what he's doing, and that's understandable. But the point is that if you boo the anthem, you're not hurting Trump. You're hurting the ordinary American who sees only the fact that, and Americans are much more patriotic than we are. They have been throughout their whole career. The flag is something incredible for them. It's something that they venerate. And so the fact that we're booing the anthem is just showing disrespect to the country, to the people,
mm.
to Americans, and to me. So that's how I see it. And I people may not agree with everything I say here, but this is the way I see it. You may not, and if you disagree with what President Trump is doing, that's fine. There are other ways to show it, but booing the anthem is not the way to do it.
Okay, so I think that sounds like a smart diplomatic insight is that let's keep it a sporting event between friendly nations and friends and not
Yeah, I mean,
politicize it.
how many tariff decisions have the U.S. Hockey team made about Canada? All they want to do, they want to win for their country. I mean, Canadians, and yes, it is tonight. But my wife and I will be watching this very closely, and but
Mhm.
and I hope Canada comes back and beats the U.S. But
Yes, indeed.
whether it's the U.S.
Yeah,
anthem or any other anthem, that represents a people.
right on. So there's other comments here. I believe D Ski says 9/11 was 14 years ago. It sounds like we're good friends. Yeah, indeed, we work together. And I think, General, you were literally right there working with the United States. Can you tell us more about the significance of that relationship as you went to Tampa, Florida, and you were there at the command center?
It was an incredible historic moment, of course. 9/11 happened, and I happened to be the Assistant Deputy Chief of Defense Staff, and my job was to, to be part of the operations of, what are we going to do, how are we going to reply to this, and how are we going to react to this. So, you can imagine a big room with all the different staff in there, with making the decisions to land all the airplanes. Coordinating with NORAD completely, and what happened in those days, all the airplanes that were in the air landed, and that was it. Some that didn't land, we were kind of testing whether they could be a terrorist aircraft. But a few days after 9/11, so on the 3rd of October, so 9/11, right, September 11th, and 3rd of October, a couple of weeks after, the Chief of Defense Staff, General Ray Hinault, asked me to go down to Tampa to speak with General Franks and see what what the Canadian Armed Forces could provide to the coalition of the willing they were putting together for the war on terrorism. And so I flew down with two colleagues, two brigadier generals, one from the Navy, one from the Air Force, and went down there. And I'll tell you, in the morning meetings with General Franks, he was sitting at the head of the table, kind of a U-shaped table, and to the right of him was the sign Canada, to the left was the sign UK, and Australia on the other side of the UK. So we were sitting at the right of the United States there. This is how much Canada, meant to the U.S. as our closest ally. So this is, 2011, so it's a long time ago. 2001, so it's a long time ago. But so that's where Canada was, and I explained this in the book that we meant something in those days. And on the 7th of October, at that 9 o'clock meeting in the morning, I come in and I sit down, and General Franks, and on the VTC video teleconference was Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, who said President Bush would have been here, but he just got pulled away, but he sends his best. And General Franks said, Mr. Secretary, gentlemen, ladies, at 12 o'clock today, our time, the first Tomahawk land attack missile will fall in Kabul, the start of the war. And it was a historic moment. I mean, I get shivers even talking about it now. So I went back to my office, called our Chief of Defense Staff. I said, this is what's happening. And he called Prime Minister Chrétien, who said, that's why George W. wants to speak to me at 11 o'clock today. So, the armed forces, the Canadian forces being involved with the Americans so close, the fact that I had managed to get a hold of the Chief of Defense Staff gave great credibility to the armed forces that were able to warn our Prime Minister ahead of time. But that's where we were. I'm not sure we have that relationship today because our military is in such disrepair.
So I'm speaking today with our friend, Lieutenant General Michel Maisonneuve, and we're talking about his book, In Defense of Canada, Reflections of a Patriot. And so General, your point, I think, is a very powerful illustration there, where in your experience working very closely with our allies, including the United States, Canada mattered on the world stage. And I think this is a key point of your book, is that Canada mattered, and now we have exited the world stage. And this is perhaps a story that I think perhaps most Canadians don't know. We have exited the world stage. So what do you mean by that?
Well, you mentioned earlier that Canadians, and I think what you were saying, Canadians don't realize the importance of the military in terms of our ability to participate in international missions, our credibility, our ability to defend ourselves, first of all, right? I mean, you want to defend our country. Right now, we're unable to defend our country. Our forces are that weak. We're missing a whole bunch of personnel. Our equipment is old and falling apart. New equipment is not going to be coming for many, many years. And regardless of what the commander of the Navy says, and he says we can protect our north, I take huge issue with that. So we're unable to protect ourselves. because of that, we are unable also to participate in missions outside. So, for example, UN missions, we were always a huge participant in UN missions, at times right up to 4,000 of our soldiers working in UN missions across the world. Right now, the only commitment we have outside of Canada in terms of operational commitment, a real operational commitment that we're sustaining, is the one in Latvia. But even that, our part of a brigade group in Latvia is at the strength of about 2,000 right now, and it's part of the NATO reaction to what's going on in Ukraine. But that commitment is so hard for the Canadian Forces to maintain. It takes the entire armed forces of Canada to maintain that. Now, the other piece, of course, is our Navy is weak. That we have a few ships here and there. We have no submarines available, so we can't patrol the north. We can't patrol our coasts. The Air Force is waiting very avidly for the F-35. It's going to take a few years because we made the decision so late, where we've been participating in this program for more than 10 years. We could have made the decision 10 years ago to get this aircraft. It would be in service today. Because we have to extend our CF-18s longer and longer. We're missing hundreds of pilots, so we have difficulty flying all the aircraft that we own right now. So this is that, when I say we've exited the world stage, what that means is we're not consulted. We're not even consulted in when new alliances are being made. For example, the AUKUS alliance, which was made a few years ago, which is the United States, the UK, and Australia. It was all about protecting the Pacific. We are a Pacific nation. We were never asked. We were never consulted. Now we're very much trying to get into the tier 2 portion of AUKUS, but we have no answer yet on this because our forces are so weak. And so this is what I mean by exited. We've exited the world stage. We're not consulted. We're not even thought of actually at this point.
Okay, so this is the wake-up call, is it? That we have allowed our armed forces to become so weak that we are not even consulted or reached out to on a myriad of kind of basic military exercises and very important issues, like AUKUS is really related to, of course, the Pacific there with Australia, United States, and New Zealand. We're not involved, right? And this is a huge problem. So interoperability, the ability to work that intimately with our allies, is critical as we look at these strategic threats. So Canada is no longer a player, and this is the brutal reality. So when people reflect fondly of Canadian military history in terms of not just the world wars, but peacekeeping, and you played a very key role in many major missions where Canada played a major role in peacekeeping. I mean, these are dangerous assignments. We're no longer a player, and I guess to me this is really a kind of a disturbing, sad story to hear that kind of reality. And so as you've been talking with Canadians from coast to coast, do you think most Canadians are aware of that reality, General?
I don't think so. And the other thing I could add to that, David, is the fact that we often talk big. We talk big. Our prime minister is great at scolding other nations and at talking and making commitments, just like he made a commitment to have a high speed rail, for example. Billions of dollars. But I'll probably be dead before we see any of this. So we're big at talking, and and even though we have one or two officers serving in different places for example, in Africa, or that doesn't mean that we're at the table when decisions are made. And so it is a function of where Canada is, of its leadership currently, and I'll say even political leadership, that is scolding other nations and has different priorities than other nations, and so when the decisions are made, we're just not there. That's the thing. Okay. And I've seen the reverse, where Canada mattered, and we were at the table. Our opinion was sought. We were a strong middle power. We've never been a superpower, but we're part of the G7. We have a huge economic, resource-based country that has incredible resources, and so we have an incredible potential. We're just not reaching it, and so we're not at the table when these decisions are made now.
Okay, well, it's really quite admirable that you are speaking up because I mean you didn't have to. You had both the insight, the courage, and the commitment to articulate this because, to back up a little bit, you're an award-winning um, leader within Canada's armed forces. You served some 35 years in different theaters, and you get awards not only from the United States, France, but also our own country, Canada. And you get awarded the Vimy Award, and you show up in front of an esteemed crowd within the Ottawa elite, some 650 people to be precise, at Ottawa's Museum of Civilization. It's a remarkable building. And you lay out thoughtfully, and I remember reading your speech clear as a bell when it was published, to the credit of the National Post. And it was like, how does anyone disagree with any of this? It's all very factually based. It wasn't like you were saying anything that many thoughtful observers have not talked about. And yet, what was the reaction to your analysis that we've got a problem here?
Well, first of all, talking about courage, it takes a bit of courage, but you compare that to the courage of our men at Vimy, of our young men and women in Afghanistan. That's real courage. To be able to speak up, though, that's part of what we ought to be doing, all Canadians. And I put in the book, I
Indeed.
dedicated the book to the silent majority. Let's not be silent anymore. Let's speak up. So the reaction you're asking me, well, the reaction has been generally very positive. I only had, I had a few weirdos after the speech kind of, write me and say nasty things, but it was a very, very minor group. Most people who actually wrote to me said, thank you for speaking out. Thank you for saying those things that we believe as well. And keep speaking. And I can say even, David, some folks that are serving in the military right now, that couldn't say, they can't speak. So I'm kind of their voice. I'm one of the people who kind of is their voice. So happy to do it, and I will continue.
So bravo. And your dedication, I thought, was very thoughtful. It said, to the silent majority of Canadians, old or new, who went to work to make our country better, who want to, pardon me, work to make our country better, let's be silent no longer. So I think that's a very good challenge to each and every one as Canadians to speak up. And if we care about these issues, we thoughtfully discuss them in true Canadian fashion that's based on facts and evidence, not nonsense. So bravo. There's a lot of very good comments here from our audience, and we really appreciate it. One of the comments that was a little bit earlier, I think, was a question about procurement, because we've talked a lot about some of the hardware issues, like the lack of submarines, the challenge of this country going in endless circles for years, procuring the F-35. It's bizarre. They went through, as I recall, the initial procurement process was initiated by the Chrétien government. And meanwhile, it's like parties come back and can't seem to execute on that. It's just utterly bizarre. So the question from Peter Lang is, why is military procurement so incredibly slow and complex in Canada?
Well, I'm not a procurement expert, but I'll tell you, I've worked a little bit on some of these things, and there are many. It's a many faceted thing. First of all, who has the authority to say, let's go with this? And that usually the problem is it's more than one minister in the cabinet that has the authority. Secondly, regulations. There are regulations in Canada in terms of procurement that the company that wins the bid has to return a whole bunch of, I think it's 100% of the value to workers in Canada. It's called industrial regional benefits, I believe. And so that's an issue because the companies need to turn themselves inside out to be able to do that. The third thing I would say is in terms of cost, trying to get out there and getting 3 or 4 bids. That takes time. It takes time to evaluate. It takes time to see whether the bid actually fits with the description of the requirement. And the other thing is, of course, is the requirement exactly what we need, or can we do with something a little bit less? So that's very complex. And before it gets to that point, it takes a while. Another piece for me is that's very important is that the amount of money allocated can be cut anytime. So if you imagine a company that's going to sell us a new tank, because I love tanks, so I'm a tanker. And so
yes, indeed.
if you're going to sell us a new tank, the company will say, well, we're developing the tank. So the project will go over 4 or 5 or 6 or even sometimes 10 years. And every year some money will be allocated to that. What happens? The government says, oh, well, we need to do a better job on we need to cut the deficit. So we're going to cut $1 billion out of national defense, which, by the way, they're doing this year. And they did last year. And when the minister says it has no operational impact, it's not true. It's bull, because it does have an impact. And so on procurement, as soon as you start cutting the budget, what happens? The project gets delayed, gets descoped, it's called, gets pushed out further out. So it takes a long time. And who gets mad about this is the company who's selling you the equipment, because they're expecting that the project will go along, and then when you start cutting, well, they have to lay off people, they have to, it's got a huge impact on so a lot of companies just don't want to do business with the government, because this is just so complex, so difficult. And so these are some of the
But your point, though, is a really key one. It's complex, it's arduous, so there's a ton of red tape. But because of the uncertainty of procurement around this, you're actually scaring off the private sector partners that have the technology and the ability to deliver, because they don't want to work with the government, because the government is so nasty to deal with. That's kind of the point, isn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'll tell you, the Business Council of Canada, which is an association of all the CEOs in the country, okay, huge thing and very powerful. The Business Council of Canada. The president, CEO of the Business Council of Canada is a guy called Goldie Hyder. Great guy, and he and the BCC have put together a report, I want to say 3 or 4 months ago, talking about specifically about defense and how industry can support defense and how we should be, what we should be doing to make it easier. And so, and the other thing I would tell you is I've seen it work, David. I've seen it, during the Afghanistan conflict, during our time in Afghanistan, we bought C-17s, a huge aircraft, and we got them from the States.
Yes.
And it took just a few months. We bought tanks from the Dutch, and it only took a few months to do that. But at that time, they were making decisions. The prime minister was there. He was making decisions. It was just incredible at that time. So,
Okay. So we've got a number of comments. Barb M says, thank you, General Maisonneuve.
Barb M, I hope that's not Barb Maisonneuve, my wife.
Okay. For your exemplary service, our military deserves better, faster, and our deep appreciation.
Thank you, Barb.
In this case, there's also an interesting comment earlier about procurement, that it's designed to actually slow it down. Denver Hodge Lentil Fund, it's almost amusing what people's handles are. The military procurement in Canada is designed to not spend the money. It only makes it appear to allies as if we're spending is made. So if I get that interesting question from Denver correctly, it's kind of like theater. It's kabuki theater, as we call it sometimes in the policy world. It's not really acting, it's pretend acting. It's like play acting. You pretend that you're an ally, but you're not really, but through sleight of hand, you're not really spending the money because you're doing it for your other political reasons. So it's the politicians, it's the elected politicians that are not doing their job here. Is it just a big game then?
Well, it's interesting. In Denver, I mean, he's maybe doing this a little bit tongue in cheek, but I think part of what he's saying may be right. I think you look at who's involved in there, and like I said, okay, which minister makes the decision? There's more than one minister. that makes the decision. Where one of the things they've been saying now that they might do when they try to fix it is to give the authority to one minister only. The French use an agency that they created, and it works very well. But the other piece of I think that's in there is that politicians love to spend money in their own riding. And so sometimes when a defense industry is in their riding, they'll prefer to go to that one, even though if the bid may not meet exactly the requirement. One of the other issues is we try to Canadianize everything. If we buy a piece of equipment, it's very often we're not actually taking it as is. We want to change, where the button should be here instead of there because that's where we like it. As soon as you do that, millions of dollars extra. My other point that I've always made is there are a lot of people in the chain that prefer not to make the decision or to say no. Because if you say no to a certain thing that's moving forward, you don't have to do any work. So it's great. You just protect yourself. You don't have to do any work. It's fantastic. You just come to work. Whereas if you say yes, boy, oh boy, it means now you got to get your act together and make some work. So I don't know. It's if the process is put together so we never spend the money. I would hope that the process should be there to support the boys and girls, the troops on the ground. They require the equipment. And, it's part of the moral contract, David. I mean, if you want to address that, I can talk about it. So the moral contract, the way I see it is Canadians who join the military, they agree to put their life on the line if necessary to do the things that we ask them to do. Defend our country, go out and do the protect our missions outside, project our values. That they agree to that. And it may get to the point where they have to give up their life to do it or ordering someone else to give their life up to do it. That's one side of the contract. They agree to that. What do Canadians agree to or should agree to is to give them all the means they have to be successful as possible. So good equipment, good training, good leadership, good education. And so that contract is broken. We have not given them the kit they need. And we have not given them the training. We have not given them the funds to actually be as effective and successful and not put their life on the line necessarily for us. So it's a broken moral contract.
Okay, so that's a very powerful statement. It's a moral broken contract. So I'm speaking with Lieutenant General Michel Maisonneuve. We're talking about his book and certainly concerns about the defense of Canada. And so just to put into context our conversation, we really appreciate the comments that people are making. Please like it, subscribe to Frontier here. We'd love to hear more of your comments. But please share it. These are important issues because we're talking about moral contracts, not only with our country, but with the people that are serving in the armed forces. We owe it to them to have proper, safe, up-to-date equipment. We owe it to our nation to be prepared. And so when we look at the issues today, we've got a lot of concerns raised by the U.S. administration. And by the way, this has happened now for decades. It hasn't just been with the Trump administration, about concerns about our commitment as a NATO ally, our border security, and of course, they see the bigger picture, like a bigger balance sheet. And so my question to you, General, and you eloquently outlined how Canada has decided to exit the world stage. Are we seen now as we're not seen as a reliable NATO ally? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that what you're getting at?
Well, I think a reliable ally means the ally can actually come and bring something to the table, can bring forces to the table. I mean, if you take what's happening between us and the United States right now, okay, what President Trump is doing there, if we had, long ago decided that we're going to have an armed forces able to defend our country, okay, if we took a blank sheet of paper and started writing down, okay, to defend Canada, what do we need? We need so many ships, so many aircraft. We need so many logistics forces, so many army forces, and so on. And you say, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to fund this. We're going to buy this equipment. We're going to recruit the people. We need an armed force of 100,000 with 200,000 reservists, let's say. and we need to be based in these areas in Canada, the North included, but right across the country so Canadians see their armed forces and everything. I'll bet you that we would not be worrying about whether we're at 2%, 3%, or whatever. We'd probably be somewhere around 4%, I think, of our GDP would be spent on the armed forces. If we had done that before, a long time ago, if we had made the Canadian Borders Services Agency strong enough to go across the border and to ensure that we have a hermetically sealed border where people can, move freely if they're the right legal folks of both countries, we wouldn't be where we are today. If we had, if our country, for example, had, interprovincial trade, we would be able to trade with ourselves, and actually our GDP would be increased. I've heard numbers incredible, like 20 billion a year greater in our GDP. And so we wouldn't have the U.S. now saying, oh, you guys, we're going to throw tariffs on you and everything. If we had, for example, if we had developed pipelines that would enable us, our resources, to help other nations get more green. For example, India and China are using coal to beat the band. If we were sending natural gas to them, which is much more green, much more environmentally conscious, then we would be able to be less subservient to the United States. So
Indeed,
we brought this onto ourselves. So yes, the fact that we're sometimes asked, or we're not asked even nowadays, as I've been saying, but in the old days, we would be asked, what can we provide? To NATO, for example, I talked about the Coalition of the Willing in the United States. We were able to provide immediately a ship, special forces, and eventually battalions that went to Afghanistan and fought extremely well. Canadians who fought extremely well, just like our forefathers did in World War II and in the First World War. So that's our problem. One of our problems today is we're unable to collaborate, participate, contribute to the world missions.
Okay, so that's a very helpful background, General. So I'm wondering if something bigger is happening here that we may not be recognizing as Canadians, and that is that it seems to me that post-World War II, and you know this history well, the United States offered a kind of a defense umbrella. They created inducements, economic deals, military deals to kind of keep the alliance together. Because with the Soviet Union, there was concerns that perhaps some countries, particularly in Europe, were wobbly. And so in that context, is there a situation here where we really are seeing, you could use the word reset, but that's kind of a loaded word, but a desire by the United States now to reconfigure the deal with our allies? They want us to pay our full freight on NATO. There's no more freeloading. They want us to not ignore all the criminal cartels in our nation and unsafe borders and money laundering that is on a huge scale here. The world largest fentanyl lab was just busted in Kelowna just a few weeks ago. We've got issue after issue now that they're saying we want to be addressed. And they're doing this across the continent. It's a classic almost naval strategy as you look at both the size of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And they're saying it, we want to redo this from Greenland to Panama. No more shenanigans with the Russians, no more shenanigans with the Chinese. We are going to reset our global security. Is that what's going on here? And we're saying, Canada, you need to step up. Instead of us treating you like a protectorate, we're going to treat you like an ally now. Is that what's going on?
And my sense is that it is a bit of a reset. Maybe it's maybe not even a reset. Maybe what we're saying is a reassessment, if you wish, of the United States' participation in the world. Everywhere in the world that, there's something going on, the United States has always been, come up. And yes, of course, sometimes it was for their own kind of natural interest or national interest and for their own reasons. But you look everywhere in the world, the United States has been contributing incredible amounts of money. I just read the other day that they were giving $6 billion a year to South Africa. Now, South Africa is a rich country in Africa when you look at it, you know.
Yeah.
Why was the U.S. doing
Right.
that? Well, they had their own reasons, but the point is that very generous. Americans are very generous. With NATO, they were they were funding everything, and they were providing, the majority of the armed forces. And not only Canada was free riding, a lot of NATO nations were free riding as well. And what you have to bear in mind is that Europe, they don't have to travel to go and fight, God forbid, the Russians or the Soviets in the old days. It was right in there, right there. The United States had to travel across the Atlantic Ocean, much like Canada, to go and do that. So, the fact that the U.S. would be so involved and so generous in providing support and help to NATO, and yes, they were the leader in NATO. They are still the leaders in NATO. And so when the U.S. says, we're actually reassessing where we are in NATO, we're reassessing where we are in the UN as well. I mean, the UN is, I've lost a lot of respect for the UN and some of the things that the UN does, only the UN can do. But right now, it's just turned into a climate alarmist, organization that wastes so much money. And again, who's paying the most in the UN? The United States. They're hosting UN headquarters on the United States. What if the United States said, well, you guys hit the road, we don't want you here anymore? So, let's stop whining about what President Trump is doing. Nobody really thinks that he's a great guy to have at dinner, and he's a little bit of a bore that way. However, the stuff he's doing right now, Americans put him in place to do it. He won the popular vote. He won both houses of Congress. So he's ready to go. And he won all the swing states. So he was elected legally. And so now we have to pay attention. And Canada has to get its act in order. And the only way we're going to do that is to have some leadership. And we don't have it right now.
So that is the opportunity, is do we have the leadership, the commitment, the wherewithal to get it together, grow up, if you will, and get our policy house in order? It's interesting. An earlier question was, how does Canada become relevant again? And I know you've got some really, I think, insightful policy prescriptions and actions. The question here specifically from Jonathan is, how can Canada become relevant again? Well, one need is our own domestic drone program, something that we can do ourselves. Drones can be cost effective and very effective. So that's an interesting take on drone technology. So how do we get it together? How do we become relevant again, General? Can you give us the summary there?
Yeah, I think, and I say in the book, and every time I speak, I talk about the fact that we need some more leadership and more service. And, leadership, you're absolutely right. And Lauren was right. Drone technology, for example, what if we equip, CBSA with more drones? I mean, we've got two now. Apparently, we've leased now 2 helicopters for the RCMP. Point is that those helicopters have no kit on them. They have nothing. They have no surveillance suites. They're just taxis. How useful is that on a border that's, more than 4,000 kilometers long? Not very useful. So let's get a grip here. Let's give the, and by the way, our government, which has been spending like drunken sailors and getting us into more and more debt, a deficit of 60 billion a year. And yet we have, what are we getting for that? We're not getting extra capability for the armed forces, none for CBSA either. Let's start spending some money and making sure that we're able to, to patrol our borders. David, you talked about the Vancouver, what do you call it? That was just found, the lab that was found. Well, all you heard in the last few weeks was that, only 41 kilograms of fentanyl was caught at the border. Well, I say, how much was not caught? Has anybody ever thought about that? Yeah. How much was not caught? Because we had nobody to go, to catch it. So, I am sure that there's a lot more than just 41 kilo. It may not be at the level of the Mexican border, but certainly we have to get a grip on ourselves, start patrolling our border and doing that. And there's a lot of stuff we can do in our own country. In the book, I talk about big ideas. Big ideas to me are things that have been missing in government since Mulroney, Prime Minister Mulroney. I thought he was the last guy that had big ideas. Since then, we've got just, kind of small kind of salami slices as we go along and evolve. We need big ideas, people who are going to, like a leader and leaders who are going to kind of say to Canadians, here's what we can do. Here's how we reach our potential. Here's an idea that is going to unify our country. And those big ideas, I named some of them, for example, and it's funny now that you're hearing, oh yeah, we're going to talk about interprovincial trade. We're going to talk about the North. We're going to talk about pipelines. And even Quebec now is saying, let's build some pipelines. So, but big ideas to unite our country under one vision. And the other thing is making Canada be the country it can be, and deciding what is a Canadian. And we are more. Our prime minister goes to the U.S. and says, well, one thing that defines us is we're not American. My God, how could he say something as idiotic as that? What is a Canadian? What defines us? What are our values? Once we define that, we are a country built on Judeo-Christian values. And so we must defend that. We must say that's what a Canadian is. And here are our values, list them. Then when an immigrant comes to our country, he or she becomes part of the Canadian melting pot. We want to get rid of the mosaic. Yeah, you can have, keep your own kind of some of your culture and some of your ideas and all that stuff. That's great. But don't come here thinking you're going to change our Canadian culture to yours. If I go to Saudi Arabia, my friend, I'm behaving very, quietly and everything. And, I'm not asking them to change to become Canadian. But when immigrants come to our country, they need to assimilate. But until we know what a Canadian is and we're able to define it, it's pretty hard to assimilate to something you don't know.
Okay, well said, General. There's a fantastic list of comments here from our audience, and we really appreciate it. I think one of the things that's so exciting about what you say, General, is that you're calling for renewal of our country. It's not just about the rebuilding of the military. It's about rebuilding our pride as Canadians,
Absolutely.
our unity, knowing our history. Instead of, like, the other day, I was looking at my my old passport versus the new one I got, and I almost had tears in my eyes because I looked at the old passport with its references to some greats within Canadian history, from Terry Fox to um, people in our history that enabled us to have voting rights for women, to issues related to the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. What an incredible accomplishment. And
there's a big idea.
And the new passport is like filled with stick people and images, and there's people playing in a backyard with a squirrel with a nut. I mean, it's just unbelievably pathetic and embarrassing to articulating the incredible grandeur of this country and its history. So it is truly a challenge that you have issued here that is, I think, from top to bottom. This country needs renewal bad, and we better get our act together and grow up as a nation. I think that's the message I keep hearing again and again from yourself and so many others. So we need big ideas. So what are some of the other comments here? One of them was get rid of woke. Get rid of this diversity, equity, inclusion nonsense where we're not defined by our identity as Canadians, but we're identified by irrelevant things like race and gender and all kinds of things. Dump woke, Maureen Brown, bravo. So, anyways, how is wokeness been impacting the military? And as you're thinking about your answer, General, I wanted to highlight an interesting analysis that came up. It said nearly three-quarters of Canadian troops are overweight. That's all symptoms of rot that's going on, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it was kind of, when that came out, I said, okay, what else could go wrong here? The problem with DEI, the problem with the obesity thing, and it was 75 or like more than 75% of Canadian Force personnel are either overweight or obese. And that is a greater percentage than the regular population. Can you imagine that? Where you would expect that military folks would be in great shape, able to fight and able to run and able to carry and help each other. They're obese or overweight. That's absolute. My wife was completely flabbergasted as I was by this. This is incredible. Look, it is. We need a renewal, and DEI specifically in the military. What it means is that we're dividing people that way. The whole identity and gender thing divides people. It divides them because some people believe in it, others don't. Right away, when you're offended because someone has done something different, and the armed forces should be a unifying organization for all Canadians. And right now it's not, I think. So, and we need to get away from the woke thing and go back to a warrior culture where actually you're developing warriors who are able to actually, where do you want warriors if it's not in the armed forces? I mean, that's where they belong. And we ought to be proud of that these guys and gals are ready to fight for us, defend our country, defend our principles and our values across the world. But it does require, I think, a complete kind of renewal of our country. You talk about the passport. Oh my God, you're absolutely right. But you know what that means? Our government, our prime minister has said Canada is not really it's a post-national state with no real culture of its own. Well, this is what I'm fighting against. I'm saying Canada, yes, we have a culture. And where do you get this culture? Where do you get these values? Where do you get them? You get them from your history, what you've done in the past. Get it from your heroes. Instead of toppling statues, we should imagine being in the shoes of John A. Macdonald and Wilfrid Laurier, trying to bring this country together. This massive, huge country with, I look outside and we got 8 feet of snow. I mean, it's unbelievable. This difficult country. And how do you unify this thing? Well, yeah, you talk about the Canadian Pacific Railroad. The building the railroad was one of the most unifying things we could have done. And so you need to have heroes. You look at your history and believe in it. And when you remove things such as statues and you remove photos of Vimy out of our passport, you are actually making you're talking about a post-national state that has no history, that has no heroes, that has immigration completely, you just let anybody come in who want to come in because you don't have a culture. These people don't need to assimilate. They can come to Canada and live in their own little niche there of whatever the country of immigration that they came from. So we need to get a grip on this and have a real kind of renewal of our country.
So the renewal of our country is really the theme of today, getting our policy house in order, renewing our country from top to bottom. That means energy self-sufficiency. It means renewing our military, free trade in Canada. Can you imagine that? That would alone mean, according to different estimates, some 4% bump in our GDP, our economy. So let's get on with it. Tomorrow, instead, Parliament is on hiatus. It's been prorogued. Last week on the live, I talked with the president of the Justice Center, John Carpe, about their legal action to challenge that, as the oral arguments were actually being heard as we spoke. We had hundreds of people on this live, and obviously there was great concern about that. But does it make any sense, General? I mean, we've both certainly been involved in different crises in our lives. Does it make sense that if there was a time when our country is being challenged and in crisis, that Parliament would be on break? Does that make any sense?
Makes absolutely no sense at all. And once again, and I've been saying this, that I see that our prime minister made the decision for himself and his party, and he decided to prorogue Parliament, start the leadership process for the Liberal Party. In spite of that, he's making all kinds of decisions. He's making decisions for me that I don't want him making those kinds of decisions, because we don't have a Parliament right now that's sitting where these decisions get challenged, and so it's absolutely ridiculous. I'm so distraught about this, and this is what I mean when I say we have a lack of leadership in our country. If we'd had an election way before now, let's say in the fall of last year, we'd have a new prime minister in place. We'd have a full Parliament that is elected by the people of Canada. We would have been able to deal with the tariffs that are going on right now. I mean, you can imagine. I really am humiliated by the way our country, our prime minister is going to to beg at the table with Mr. Trump. I mean, I feel like Mr. Trump is the principal, and we're going to the principal's office, and okay, I'll give you another 30 days, but you better sort yourself out. I mean, I feel humiliated by this, and by the way our prime minister is dealing with this. So, and he's making decisions that he shouldn't be making, huge decisions. How can he agree to spend $3.6 billion on a high-speed train? Canadians, Canadians might agree that's a great idea to do it, but let's get the Parliament involved in it and make sure that that we're there to make the right decisions.
Okay, so this is well said, General. We've got a lot of comments. Maureen Brown says, marketing and media is my line of work. It's pathetic to see how they manipulate our country, paid for by the Liberal Party, I believe in this case. There needs to be an honest media. And I think this is, from a public policy point of view, this is the point, is we need a vibrant media that's independent, that speaks truth to power. We know that the current federal government has actually paid some 2,000 media outlets a lot of money. It's not just the CBC with, what is it, their $1 billion plus budget. It's the 2,000 media outlets that all receive generous federal funding. Is that, in your mind, is Margaret onto something here? Or sorry, Maureen
Margaret's
Brown,
absolutely right.
Is she onto something here?
I think she is onto something. It's and the issue right now with media is, if you go slightly against the usual narrative, if you go, there's the narrative that comes out on in the media, and if you kind of go against that to try and get a little more balance, you get canceled. You're thought of as a Neanderthal. I mean, I was called a Neanderthal for my views. I was called a dinosaur.
No kidding.
And I don't think my views are that extreme. I don't believe actually in extremism of any kind. Left-wing extremism,
Indeed.
which there is a lot of already, and the left. And my wife always says the left think themselves, the most tolerant and the most this and the most that. They support all these special interest groups and everything, and yet they are the most intolerant of anyone. And in the media, you can see that. You just have to read some comments in the media and some articles, and completely intolerant of a difference of point of view, which I'm sure Margaret would agree that what we want is a media, balanced media that looks at the facts, that actually does its work, its background work. And then separates reporting from opinion. That's another thing I talked about in my speech in 2022, was the fact that the line is quite blurred right now, and you'll have reporters actually reporting, but then they're adding a little bit of their own opinion in there, which is it's not the way to do it.
Okay, but what occurs to me is that there is a significant onus on us as citizens to think critically and look at the facts here, because so much of what we're fed is narrative. It's not really based on facts. And I think that's certainly one of the things that we advocate here at Frontier, is that people really look at the facts. And that's a bit of a journey. So you've emphasized many times in your book the importance of freedom of speech. And I think that's a great insight. Why do you think freedom of speech is so important, General?
Well, because if I'm talking about let's get the silent majority speaking out, if you're going to do that, then if you're getting beat up every time you make a statement, or you have an opinion and you state it, then you're not going to have freedom. You're not going to want to speak, and the silent majority will stay silent. So I think it's very important that we have freedom of speech. I for 45 years I protected freedom of speech. I was the guy amongst hundreds of thousands that were ready to go, defend our freedom of speech. The fact that people could speak out, give their opinion. My freedom of speech was restricted in those 45 years because I was inside the machine. And when I gave my opinion, it was to the inside of the machine, and I tried to change things if I didn't agree with them. And if I'd got to a point where I completely disagreed with an action, I would have got out, because that's the choice you have. You either stick with the program, try to fix it from the inside, or you get out and talk about it outside. So freedom of speech is extremely important. And now that I have it, I'm able to give my opinion. Then I'm hoping to start a dialogue. And this is what the whole idea is, to be able to have a dialogue. And I appreciate today having this dialogue with you and with your viewers.
Well, we certainly appreciate that you could be with us, General. And as we kind of wrap up things today, I am struck by the fact that you have served our country and you took the ultimate pledge to sacrifice yourself in defense of its freedom and liberty. And I think that's not lost on our audience. And certainly I encourage people to read your book called In Defense of Canada, Reflections of a Patriot. So as we get to the end of our discussion today, I guess my question is, um, do you see signs of hope for our country? I mean, I think this is a critical time for our nation as we struggle with both unity and purpose, but also a practical agenda, a plan, if you will, to renew ourselves from an economic and cultural point of view. Where do you see signs of hope? Where are you seeing that, General?
Well, I see signs of hope in some of the new leadership pushing up, pushing through political leadership, of course. I'm a supporter of Pierre Poilievre. Certainly, the Conservatives cannot screw up our country more than the Liberals have done it so far in the last 10 years. I think Pierre has a good program. I think he's got the right approach with Canadians. He understands what Canadians need, what Canadians want. And so I'm happy from that point of view. But you know what, David, I also have a lot of faith in Canadians themselves. I think Canadians can get to a point where they make our country great, where they work hard. And I mentioned leadership and I mentioned service. And I think the service piece is perhaps the one that we need to push on, that every Canadian can serve his or her community. Every Canadian can serve his or her colleague, fellow citizen, and I think that's where we need to go. We need to have more service, and it doesn't need to be military service necessarily, but we need people to serve each other. And Ronald Reagan said that's one of the things that was a wellspring of our country in the United States. Ronald Reagan said this, and I think it applies to Canada as well. More volunteerism, more service to each other. I think a national service program for young men and women would be fantastic. That would, for example, work with Parks Canada or any other kind of our institutions to our north, helping our First Nations. My goodness, they could really, help have some support from Canadians. So there you go. Jonathan Jollymore, he volunteers. This is the kind of stuff we need. That's what's going to bring us out of our lethargy. Leadership and service.
Well, I certainly like what you're saying, General, and I'm sure I speak for the entire audience that we have very much appreciated our conversation today. And thank you very much to the audience for your numerous questions and comments. We very much appreciate them. We are all united under one flag, the flag of Canada, and we do so proudly. And in that spirit, we want to thank everyone for participating today. And thank you, General, for your ongoing analysis and leadership in your role. And thank you for joining us today.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, David. Thank you to you and your viewers. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's it for today's discussion on Leaders on the Frontier. Be sure to join us next week, this Thursday, same time, same place, where we'll be talking with the authors of a brilliant book, Why Marriage Still Matters. Imagine that. So be sure to join us and engage in that discussion as well. So in the meantime, I wish you a terrific week and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.